Hello everyone, welcome to this message. So today I would like to do something else than I usually do, and that is to connect to an ancient philosopher, right? And the ancient philosopher that was selected by God was Albert Camus. And I want to connect that to the Star Wars universe, right? So you could see the Star Wars universe a little bit as an entryway, right? So we start from the world of Star Wars to get a little bit of an entryway, an access point into the vast work of Albert Camus, right? So to be able to access that world, we are using the access point of the Star Wars universe. So and to be more specific, we're going to start the message, and we're going to talk about multiple things, right? We're going to start the message with the planet Hoth, and which is very, very interesting. So if you've never heard of the planet Hoth, and I also was never not acquainted with the Star Wars universe, right? So I was told to to use the the world of Star Wars as like the access point, the entryway into Albert Camus' work. But like I don't know anything about Albert Camus nor about Star Wars either. So both these worlds were unfamiliar to me before, but now I have some grasp on the Star Wars universe, so I understand the basics and such, and now I understand some concepts a little bit deeper, right? And we really dove into the heart of Camus' work, though. So let's see, and like every time you connect to an ancient philosopher or like a genius from the past, like for example, like Da Vinci, for example, or like Seneca, in terms of like a philosopher, like it leaves you changed as a person, right? So, and this is definitely a video, these are definitely notes I made, I prepared, that change your life, right? It does something to you, it changes you forever. So I do think like any philosopher seems to be doing that, right? That has survived history, you could say. And so yeah, so there's a reason why they have survived history, let's just say it like that, right? So we start with the planet Hoth. So you may not know what the planet Hoth actually is in the Star Wars universe if you're not acquainted with it, and I was also not acquainted with it before, so I'm going to explain it to you. So the planet Hoth is considered to be an ice planet in the Star Wars universe, but despite its harsh climate, it does support life, this planet. For example, it is home to the hulking white-furred predators known as wampas, as well as tauntauns and various other species like ice worms, for example. Yeah, but the environment is actively hostile. It's not just an ice planet, it's also actively hostile in the sense that this coldness, of course, makes it a hostile environment, but there are multiple reasons why it is a hostile environment. For example, when we talk about cold, we are talking about temperatures on a planet that can plummet to minus 60 degrees Celsius or 76 degrees Fahrenheit. And the planet is routinely hit by winds and by intense blizzards. So this makes it a very hostile environment. Now, although the surface of the planet is generally considered to be too harsh for intelligent life to naturally develop there are subterranean ice caverns that are thermally being warmed up by the planet's core, right? So, which also made this frozen world an ideal and concealing hiding spot for the Rebel Alliance Echo Base, right? So, the Rebel Alliance Echo Base was located there, and it was conceal an ideal place to go and hide, right? To hide their headquarters. So the planet Hoth was home to the temporary headquarters of the Rebel Alliance in the Star Wars universe, and the base was operational for about a year before an Imperial probe droid discovered it. The Battle of Hoth that followed resulted in a base destruction, and this forced the rebellion to regroup at the Haven rendezvous point, right? So that's a little bit the backstory, so you have a little bit of an idea, like what is this planet Hoth that she is talking about, right? Now, how does that relate to Camus, right? So Camus talks about like its main concept of his work pretty much is about the absurd, right? But if you would It's kind of fascinating, right? So Star Wars is being picked as the like the team, the world to start from. Then you get the planet Hoth, which is like an ice planet. And if you hear Camus talking about the absurd, like it seems to be, you could say that the planet Hoth is the depiction of that. Is the depiction of Camus' concept of the absurd, right? So it's a very good visual metaphor to work with to access his work to make it more accessible, right? And so, what is the absurd? So, the absurd arises from the collision between a cold, apathetic universe and a human need for meaning. So, which makes Hoth a perfect metaphor for this concept by Camus, right? So, as the weather on this planet is also, you could say, is also indifferent to human life. It is hostile to life, and it offers nothing pretty much. This planet, so which relates to Camus' idea of how he sees the outside world, you could say, right? So Camus once wrote, "I have suffered from being alone, but because I have been able to keep my secret, I have overcome the suffering of loneliness." So I wrote down, Camus saw isolation as a condition that can be transcended, and but not as a condition that needs to be escaped, right? So he saw, like Camus saw isolation, which pretty much, like you could say, like before the Rebel Alliance was like situated there for like a year, right, on this icy planet, like it's pretty much an empty planet in a way, right? There is a life, but there's not really intelligent life, you could say. So I've already explained, like there's not really a world that is the surface, at least, of this world is not meant to be inhabited, right? It's not able to be inhabited by intelligent life. But the Rebel Alliance did go live in those icy caverns, right? So they did survive there, but not in a way like that they were thriving or something, right? So so there is something here about like isolation, right? So you could see this planet as a planet of isolation, pretty much, right? So not much lives there, and so Camus he saw isolation as a condition that can be transcendent, right? But not as something that needs to be escaped. And very fascinatingly, he said this: "In the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer." So it's kind of interesting, right? Like just like the Rebel Alliance tried to make the best of things on this icy cold planet, right? Which was the ideal hiding place for the Rebel headquarters, right? Um, this is a little bit like, and why is this fascinating? Because Camus, he even wrote you even wrote a book called The Rebel, right? His entire work is about rebellion, pretty much. So to talk about rebellion and Star Wars, like that, these two are connected is obvious, right? So it's a perfect team to connect with each other, and I had no idea that these were so connected. So very interesting. And then he goes on to say, "In the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer," right? So yeah, so the coldness of the outside world, according to Camus, doesn't have to determine what lives inside a person, right? So you can have a very, very cold environment, a very cold world. So Camus saw this world as quite a cold world, right? And as cold and as hostile and as unsupportive of life, you could say, as the planet Hoth, right? So it is a great metaphor to talk about that you can visualize it. So he says that the coldness of the outside world doesn't have to determine what lives inside a person, right? So just like in the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer, right? So summer lives within you, even if you are in winter time outside of you, right? So which is also very interesting because I do think it holds much more significance in terms of like if you want to see it as a message, right? So yeah, so the Rebel Alliance, they built a highly, you could say, a highly uncomfortable, high stress and bare bones existence on Hoth, right? So their echo base was pretty much, you should consider it, you should see it as nothing more than a functional military outpost that was entirely focused on survival and concealment, but not so much on comfort, right? So maybe there is a message in it for you as well, because these notes are also messages, right? So take it as it resonates, of course. Um, so it could be that you are also in a place where you are surviving, where you are perfectly concealed, and it's not a very comfortable place, perhaps, right? Could be maybe you are living in uncomfortable, high stress, and bare bones existence, perhaps. I don't know what this is talking about, but there are, or it could just not be talking about that at all. But like there is a lot of significance in terms of what Camus' ways of looking at the world um, is very valuable, right? So Camus believed that meaning is not inherent to the world. He believed that it must be fabricated by our own consciousness in a cosmos that is, according to him at least, fundamentally indifferent to us, just like the weather on the planet Hoth is to its inhabitants, right? So the weather on the planet Hoth is completely indifferent, fundamentally indifferent to its inhabitants, right? The weather doesn't care if you are whether life will survive on that planet or not, right? Like it literally is indifferent. It really doesn't care, right? So it talks about the condition of this world in a sense, and Camus saw this world as being a very indifferent place, you could say, and just like this like that life was indifferent to us, you could say, right? Um, he said that you don't find truth out there. You have to construct it amidst the cold outside world and against the silence. And the silence, he means like the silence of the universe. That if you are seeking meaning, for example, that according to Camus at least, I don't think he believed in God, right? He believes that if you asked um, the universe anything, right, that there's just silence. So he probably didn't have the ability to communicate with God, right? But he has a very valuable perspective nonetheless. So he wasn't seeking refuge, you could say, in religion, right? He wasn't seeking refuge in anything. Like he wasn't even seeking a lot of things that we find that hold meaning, you could say. Um, so let's just see. So rather than finding your purpose, Camus argues that people need to actively construct meaning, so meaning on earth, right, through their work, through their relationships, and through their commitments to others. He believed that life had no inherent meaning. He saw the universe as being silent and indifferent to our human desperate search for purpose, and he believed that there was no such thing as an inbuilt destiny as a built-in destiny. That this search was just a waste of time, right? So he was very like if you want someone to teach you about how to deal with if you if there is no hope, for example, in your situation, Camus can give you a lot of advice because like it doesn't it's not really a hopeful perspective, you could say, right? It was not about it was all about like not falling for false hope, for example, right? He found a different way to engage with life, which is very valuable. So he didn't believe in a built-in destiny. He didn't believe in purpose. He didn't believe in meaning. Like he believed that you all had to construct this yourself, right? So he didn't believe in a lot of things, you could say, and he still found a lot of meaning in life. So which makes him a very valuable teacher, right? So he believed that you could create your own meaning through active engagement with the world around you, through your work, your relationships, and your commitments. Camus interestingly wrote a book called The Rebel, right, which is very interesting in this case, in which he argues that rebellion, right, revolt, creates values, dignity, and solidarity. Pretty much, pretty much what the Rebel Alliance in Star Wars is all about, I wrote. Um, he famously said, "The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion." So he believed that this world was an unfree world, right? But instead of seeing it as something negative, right, as seeing it as though this unfree world didn't have meaning, right? No, he created his own meaning, right? And also he like he says here, right, the only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. So he saw it as his purpose, you could say, as the meaning of life to show an act of rebellion towards this indifferent existence, you could say, and towards this unfree world by becoming so absolutely free within that unfree world, right? That your very existence becomes an act of rebellion. So he saw a lot of meaning in the act of rebellion in and of itself. So he believed that you should never give up and that you need to live in defiance to this cosmic indifference. Yeah, and that was what his whole philosophy of rebellion, freedom, and passion was all about. It was all about rebellion against the silent universe he believed in. You could say that Camus lived his entire career, metaphorically speaking, living on oath, right? As a rebel refusing to surrender to an icy planet, insisting to build something meaningful in what pretty much could be considered a freezing void, right? So that's how he saw the world. And then I would like to move into a quote in the Star Wars universe, which was made by Gold5, and it is "stay on target." So it says "stay on target." So when does he say "stay on target"? It's a line that was said by Gold5 while he was being shot at, seconds before he was about to die, which makes this line that is pretty much about focus and discipline, which makes this line pretty much about focus and discipline in the face of mortal danger, right? Now, in his 1942 essay by Camus, right, which is called The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus conveys the idea of keeping your eyes on whatever task you have assigned yourself and to do it fully consciously, even when you believe the task you are doing may be futile and the outcome is quite uncertain. So, so he's talking about sometimes we do things, right? Like we assign a task to ourselves, right? So he would definitely assign tasks to himself. He would create meaning to his own existence, right? By assigning tasks to himself, right? And these tasks that you have assigned to yourself, whatever it may be, right? Maybe you are reaching a goal, it could be anything that you want to do this fully consciously and that you even when you believe that the task you are doing is pretty much futile and the outcome is quite uncertain, that you keep doing it fully consciously, right? So in his essay there is a line that goes like this, that appears just before the closing line of the essay: the struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. And then straight after it says, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. So he would say that you should stay committed to the task at hand, regardless of what you think the outcome might be, right? So this is a message in and of itself, right? So Camus would argue that even though you may not know what the outcome may be, right? So maybe you think the task is completely futile. Maybe you think that the outcome is very uncertain or very unlikely to even happen. And so it makes me think about, for example, like if you, now I'm going to keep it general for now. I'm going to go a little bit more personal a little bit later because I don't think the time has come for that yet. But within the notes, right? So let's just move forward. But anyway, so it talks about like when that you should stay committed to the task at hand, regardless of what you think the outcome might be, right? So which has to do with like this world being all about being successful, right? Like that the meaning lies in achieving a goal, that the meaning lies in becoming successful, right? But I think, and that is also how Camus would think, he is quite realistic, right? But in an optimistic way. He's really realistically optimistic, you could say. And like what Camus wants to teach us is that there's value, there's meaning in, even if you, for your entire life, are striving to be successful, right? Are trying to be successful, are trying to achieve something, it doesn't matter. There's meaning in the trying, right? So Camus would say something like, at least you tried and there was meaning in your trying, right? So even if a person tries their freaking entire lives, right, there is meaning in that trying. So yeah, so that's very, very significant because we don't really, the world doesn't really look at it that way, right? So it's more than just saying, I will just keep on going, even though I think it's futile, even though I think the outcome is very unlikely or quite uncertain, but I will just keep on going anyway. For example, if you've failed your entire existence, right, the chance that you will not fail in the next attempt will be quite unlikely, right? So if you would see it like Einstein, right? Like, is it Einstein? Like, how do you know the future, right? Like, you just look at your past and you will see the future, kind of. That's kind of how people think, right? Which doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? But anyway, but there is something about it, right? So even when you yeah, just keep on trying, you failed after failed after failed, right? Then this message wants to give you a different kind of hope in the sense like, even if you fail your freaking entire existence, at least you tried, at least your life was an act of rebellion, pretty much, right? An act of rebellion in this world. So see it as being meaningful, right? Even if you never get there, like it is meaningful in and of itself, right? So it just continues. So in the essay, Camus uses the mythological figure of Sisyphus, who is condemned for eternity to push a boulder up a mountain, only for it to roll back down as a metaphor for the human condition. The quote highlights Camus' philosophy of the absurd. Instead of giving up to despair because life has no ultimate guaranteed meaning, we should find dignity, purpose, and joy in the act of striving itself, right? That's what he's all about. Find purpose in the striving, find joy in the striving, find dignity in the striving. You should be proud of yourself because at least you're trying, right? At least you are trying to get somewhere. Even if you never get somewhere, there is meaning in that. In the act of rebellion, there's dignity, there's purpose, there's meaning in that keeping on doing that, right? And he would even argue that there's joy in that as well. So and there is no, the life may not have ultimate guaranteed meaning, right? So just like a life may not have ultimate guaranteed success, for example, right? So like we all, it's kind of like Camus is the antidote to false hope, you could say. That you could, even if you would, your life never becomes meaningful, for example, right? Like in your eyes, right? Of course, every life is meaningful. But even if that would be the case, even if you would never be recognized, never be successful, always never gain any kind of income or whatever it may be that you're striving for, right? At least you tried. So give yourself that meaning, give yourself that purpose of the act of rebellion that you are alive, that you're still striving, right? So let's see. So and then we have also this quote by Yoda, which is very similar, that I always also was guided towards, which is do or do not. There is no try. That's what Yoda says, right? Which you can immediately hear is in direct opposition to what Camus would argue, although there are some similarities, but not very many, right? So they are pretty much like in opposition to each other, but there are also ways which you could say that they agree. So we are having a little bit of a Yoda versus Camus discussion here in terms of life philosophy. So Yoda in Star Wars, I wrote, has a similar line that goes like this: "Do or do not. There is no try." Yoda is all about being committed to something and about exerting one's willpower, that you should not hesitate but rather act decisively. His philosophy is all about intention driving one's action steps, but there being no room for any kind of ambiguity, right? Ambiguity, so like uncertainty or like wishy washy, yeah. So while Camus would argue that you need to be okay as a person to sit with uncertainty, with ambiguity, so when things are not really clear, right? And with there not being any clear answers, right? So he believes that life doesn't always give you clear answers, that sometimes life is uncertain, right? And that you have to be able to be someone who sits with uncertainty, who sits with ambiguity. So when things are not really clear, and when there are not really clear, that are not really clear answers available to you, right? And that you don't resolve this uncertainty, this ambiguity, or this lack of clear answers through sheer pure willpower, like Yoda would say, right? Rather, he would have been actually deeply suspicious of any kind of philosophy that would claim that it cuts through doubt cleanly, right? So to this kind of doubt that's like inherent to the human condition, you could say, right? We would like to eliminate that, but that would not be realistic, you could say, right? It's very optimistic, but it's not very realistic in a way. So maybe for some people, like you, like I think we all have seen people who seem to be destined for success, right? So like life is like extremely easy to them, and like other people, like they struggle their entire freaking existence, right? Obstacle after obstacle, opposition after opposition. That life is one big resistance to life, you could say, right? So we are talking about the people whose life is like one big resistance journey towards life, right? So so he believed that revolt was something that had to be lived, not just contemplated. Yes, that rebellion without action is to be considered meaningless. So in that sense, you could say that they agree, right? So Yoda and Camus do agree in the sense that he also says that the revolt is something that has to be lived, right? And not just contemplated. You have to do something. You have to be an act of rebellion, right? Through your action steps. That rebellion without action is to be considered meaningless, right? But Camus would never dismiss the trying, the struggle, and the uncertainty of life. That tension is actually the whole point for him of being alive. So the whole point of being alive for him is the trying, which is amazing. Why I'm getting chills. So like so he would say like the whole point of being alive is the trying, is the struggle, is the uncertainty of life, right? That's why he finds meaning, that's why he finds purpose, that's why he finds motivation, right? Passion. So joy, maybe, even because it is mentioned that he even finds joy in that. So that's what this is, right? So Sisyphus in the story, right, in the myth, he doesn't really achieve anything, right? Which is amazing, right? So Sisyphus doesn't really achieve anything. He tries endlessly, and that's exactly what makes him heroic. Sisyphus is the ultimate absurd hero precisely because he accepts the endless futility of his task but he chooses to push the boulder anyway, right? So he understands that it is futile what he is doing, right? He understands that it's endless futility of his task at hand, right? So yes, I'm pushing this boulder up the hill and then it will roll down again. I will push the boulder up the hill and then it will roll down again, right? So I do think like a lot of people on earth have this very same journey as Sisyphus, right? Like, yeah, my life is like pushing the boulder up the hill and then the boulder comes down again, right? That can be expressed in a million different ways, but like, yeah. But and you could even see it as you could see that boulder in specific ways, specific boulders, but also like just in a much bigger way as well, right? So I do think that it means something else, that it is a great metaphor for so many different human conditions that this is talking about, right? But a lot of people relate to Sisyphus in a sense, right? So, but he accepts this endless futility of his task and he chooses to push the boulder anyway, which is the whole point, right? Him pushing the boulder, you could say, is an act of rebellion, right? He keeps on pushing the boulder even though he knows it's going to roll down. He keeps on pushing the boulder his freaking entire life. And that in and of itself is something you should be proud of, is what God wants to say. That is a freaking act of rebellion that makes you a personal hero in your personal life, right? So so that's what Camus means with the fundamental condition being defined by the absurd, by the tension between our desperate human desire for meaning and the universe's absolute silent indifference. So I do think that we feel that, right? That's absolute silent indifference of the universe, not so much of God, right? But the universe, right? So rather than trying to resolve this tension, Camus argues that we must embrace the struggle and live fully within it, right? So embrace the struggle and live fully within it. Don't try to resolve the tension, because it's not always true that the boulder one day gets over the hill, right? Which is an amazing metaphor, right? So even like, okay, yes, try and like give it your all like Yoda, right? There is no trying. But at the same time, also let's acknowledge the trying, right? Because some people try their entire life to put the get the boulder over the hill and they never get the boulder over the hill, right? So which doesn't mean that their life was meaningless. That was a heroic act of rebellion towards life, right? Let's see. So Yoda actually pretty much has an opposite philosophy to Camus, right? Because he sees certainty as being liberation. He believes about going all in, committing fully to something, and he believes the path will then become clear. He believes that things will resolve themselves if you commit fully to it with no alternative to it, right? So kind of it's that idea about burning your ships and so that you can't even return, right? So, which is Yoda's philosophy in life. He has also got a valuable philosophy, but a different kind of philosophy, which I think is more mainstream. But Camus is very not mainstream, but it's very valuable, and I think people need to hear this kind of philosophy because it's all there. Not everyone gets the boulder up the hill, right? Doesn't mean their life was meaningless. So and doesn't mean that the act of trying to push the boulder up the hill doesn't have purpose, right? So Yoda believes Yoda believes firmly that if you want to succeed, you must abandon all hesitation. So, for example, when Luke Skywalker says to Yoda that he will give it a try, Yoda stops him, explaining to him that trying leaves room for doubt and provides him with a safety net for failure. Yoda teaches that by eliminating hesitation and unlearning one's preconceived doubts, that this is the necessary focus a person needs in order to succeed at something. So you could pretty much say that Yoda doesn't believe in trying, right? He literally says that. I don't, like, in some kind of way, he says that, right? Like, I do not believe in trying. Well, Camus at least acknowledges the real human condition of it's all about the trying. He sees life. He sees life as being about the trying, even all about the trying, the struggling, the suffering, the you know. Um, well, Yoda says there is no such thing as trying. Like, eliminate that from your vocabulary. Well, there is also something to be said about trying in and of itself, right? So, in the Jedi mindset, the path forward can only be obscured by your own inner conflict. Once you fully resolve to the Once you fully resolve to the task at hand, your mental blocks will then disappear. But Yoda also does not believe that things will miraculously resolve themselves either, without any active effort on your part. He believes that to be fully committed, right, always needs to be expressed through active effort as well as through the power of belief, right? So, while Camus would argue that the hunger for that kind of clarity, the desire to resolve the tension between doubt and action, right? So sometimes we are doubtful about the action steps we're taking, and to act as though that doubt doesn't exist is to kind of negate the authentic human existence, you could say, right? So it is to live an inauthentic life in a sense because, of course, the doubt is there, right? If you are trying to achieve any kind of goal, there is a doubt towards what kind of path you should take, what kind of action steps you should take. The doubt is part of the journey, you could say. It's an essential part of the human existence, you could say. And there's always this tension between doubt and action. And this is precisely what leads people into what he calls philosophical suicide to adopt an ideology, a religion, or a worldview that pretends to cut through the absurd rather to live honestly with it, right? So I don't, well, maybe he negates religion. I don't know. Maybe he does that, right? There's a great possibility that that's the case. But loose from that, right? Let's just look at it from the perspective of someone who actually believes in God, right? I think there's still something to be said here because what he wants to say is to adapt an ideology, a religion, or a worldview that pretends to cut through the absurd rather to live honestly with it, right? So you want to live honestly with the world as it is, right? that there is such a thing as doubt, right? Yeah, there's such a thing as faith, but there's also such a thing as doubt, right? As not really knowing what to do, not really knowing if you're the action steps you should be taking, and these kinds of things, right? The doubt, the tension between doubt and action, I think is beautifully said that way. So you can't always have clarity, right? Sometimes things are uncertain. Sometimes things aren't very clear, right? Sometimes things have an uncertain outcome, and but it's actually there's something beautiful in it as well, right? So for example, if if you are uncertain whether something is going to be successful, and actually when you look at it, you're like, this is very unlikely that this will be successful, right? Does that mean that you should not undertake that journey? Camus would probably say, of course, it's still worth taking that journey, even if you believe that you will fail for the rest of your life. It's still worth undertaking that journey, right? Because he sees the meaning in the struggle, in the suffering, in the trying, which is, in a way, a really great motivation, right? So, so why do we always assume that it's only meaningful if the there is an end result on the other side, right? So the try that Yoda seeks to eliminate, according to Camus, is exactly where living an authentic human life lives. So the try that Yoda seeks to eliminate is, according to Camus, exactly where living an authentic human life lives. Sisyphus never stops trying. He's all about trying. He never arrives at do, right? The boulder, the boulders always come back down, and Camus insists upon us imagining him happy, not despite his endless trying, but because of his endless trying. So yeah, not despite his endless trying, but because of his endless trying. So there's something about where Yoda wants to eliminate trying, right? Where Camus says, no, Sisyphus never stops trying. He's all about trying, right? And he never actually achieves anything. The only thing he does his entire life is trying, right? All of his stories are about, well, at least these two, right? These two stories are about trying and never achieving, right? And there are other stories as well, right? Like this he's written stories about trying but never achieving, and still this being meaningful, right? So the boulders always come down, and Camus insists upon us imagining him happy, not his despite his endless trying, but because of his endless trying. Well, Yoda says that Luke should stop being like Sisyphus with his trying, right, and become someone who is much more resolved than that. The real question that needs to be asked here is perhaps: is uncertainty whether something is going to have a successful outcome something to transcend or something to inhabit? Yoda would say transcend it. Camus would say inhabit it. Honestly, right? So I'm going to repeat that question if you want to contemplate it yourself. The real question that needs to be asked here is perhaps: is uncertainty whether something is going to have a successful outcome something to transcend or something to inhabit? So, yeah, and then I was guided to a character in the Star Wars universe, which is Bo-Katan Kryze. So Bo-Katan Kryze is a Star Wars character that follows the journey of evolving from an extremist rebel into her becoming the ultimate unifier of her people. So this story wasn't about her lineage or her royal title. It was about her taking personal responsibility for her actions and for the future of Mandalore. Yeah, so it was about taking personal responsibility for her actions and for the future of Mandalore. So Camus wrote this: to know oneself, one should assert oneself. Camus believed that identity is not something that you are born with or that you just discover as you are living life. So that's how he was. Whether you agree with him or not, that's his worldview, right? So it's always interesting to come across someone's worldview, even if you do not agree with it, right? So it is something you claim for yourself through your action steps, especially when you are under a lot of pressure. Bo-Katan inherited her name, her claim to the dark saber, and her right to lead, but she had to assert this. She didn't merely inherit this, right? So she may have inherited her name, she may have inherited her claim to the dark saber, and she may have inherited her a right to lead, but she still had to assert this, right? Just like Camus said, to know oneself, one should assert oneself, right? So you claim it is something you claim for yourself through your action steps, especially when you are under a lot of pressure. That is where identity is born. In during those moments when you are under a lot of pressure and how you claim yourself through your action steps. That's how you build the identity, you could say, how you claim identity, right? Even if you were born, if you would lose from Camus, right? If you would see life as having a built-in destiny, you still claim that destiny by claiming for yourself. You claim that destiny, inbuilt destiny for yourself through your action steps, especially when you are under pressure, because that's where your identity is built, right? So so she didn't just become, for example, she has a royal title, she comes from a lineage, right? But that doesn't mean that necessarily that's not enough, right? She needed to take personal responsibility for her actions. Kind of like she had to realize her inbuilt destiny. She had to realize her title, her lineage, right? Her name, her claim to the dark saber, her right to lead. She had to claim that in a sense, right? So so Camus wrote this: man is the only creature who refuses to be what he is, which is pretty much what Bo-Katan does, right? Spending much of yeah the entire storyline, you could say, refusing to be what she was, a fallen, bitter exile, and she is spending her time fighting to reclaim who she chose to be, right? So in the Rebel, it's a story, right? Like a book. I would say like a book, yeah. In the Rebel, Camus wrote about how trials and suffering can transform a private individual into someone who can lead others. Um, so so in this book, his book. So this is how do you explain this? So the Rebel, to make it clear, right? The Rebel is not an essay, right? So it's not a story like Sisyphus or like we're going to be later seeing the story of Rieu, right? So this is not really a story. This is an actual book. So if you want to read his thoughts, his philosophical work, right, you would go to the Rebel, right? So in the Rebel, you can find information about how like that's his philosophical work, you could say, right? This book. So in the Rebel, Camus wrote about how trials and suffering can transform a private individual into someone who can lead others. Suffering, suffering may be experienced on an individual level, but from the moment a movement of rebellion begins, the suffering is then to be considered to be a collective experience. Bo-Katan is a leader, which is a great example, really, right? Bo-Katan is a leader exactly because she has suffered alongside her people, lost Mandalore, and carried the grief of it all, right? So Bo-Katan wouldn't be a leader, you could say, if she hadn't suffered alongside her people. That is essential to her leadership, right? Otherwise, she wouldn't be a leader. She would just be a title, you could say, right? She would just be of a lineage. She would just have a royal title, but she wouldn't inhabit that role, right? She wouldn't be a leader if she hadn't suffered alongside her people, right? And lost Mandalore. So rebellion is not simply a reaction to oppression. Would Camus would argue that, right? Rebellion is not simply a reaction to oppression, but rather the way in which a person asserts one's worth and identity. Individuals must confront and reject the injustices that they are confronted with in their lives in order to assert their humanity according to Camus, which is pretty much what Bo-Katan's journey is all about. In The Rebel, Camus argues that revolt creates values, dignity, and solidarity. Bo-Katan doesn't lead because she holds a weapon or a title. She leads because of her revolt, her refusal to accept Mandalore's destruction as being final, which is the foundation of the values that are holding her people together. Camus also said this: when he rebels, a man identifies with other men and so surpasses himself. And from this point of view, human solidarity is metaphysical. So, what does this mean? So, I wrote this down, right? So, the very act of claiming who you are publicly and defiantly, to Camus, is to understand that other people have this exact same right to do the same, to also claim themselves publicly and defiantly, right? So, you're showing the way, right? So, if you are claiming who you are publicly and defiantly as an act of rebellion, right? Then you allow others to do the same, right? You are understanding, you are recognizing that other people have the exact same right to do the same, right? To also claim themselves publicly and defiantly. So for Camus, rebellion is not an act of selfish individualism, but a deeply relational and collective awakening, right? So you are part of the collective awakening when you rebel against this cold world, you could say, when you rebel against oppression, when you claim yourself publicly and defiantly, right? So Camus famously noted, I rebel, therefore we exist, which is interesting, right? I rebel, therefore we exist, right? I and we. I rebel, therefore we exist. So when a person dares to stand up against oppression, the person is not just saying no to oppression in order to protect themselves, right? It's not just about themselves. By drawing this boundary, the person is claiming a fundamental human boundary that actually belongs to every single individual on earth, right? It's very interesting, right? So you are claiming a fundamental human boundary that actually belongs to every single individual on earth. So you are claiming it, but you're part of a collective awakening. Well, if you are the only one, that's not a collective awakening, but anyway. So you are part of it, right? You are at least a contributing factor to the collective awakening by doing that, right? And by that you are claiming a fundamental human boundary that should be there, that actually belongs to every single individual on earth, right? I rebel, therefore we exist. So it means a lot, right? Let's see. So Camus writes about a character as well, Dr. Rieu in The Plague. And I got a reference to a star cruiser, uh, which is called MC-75, the MC-75 Star Cruiser in Star Wars. Now, there's not that much that is talking about that. It's much more like the captain who leads I don't know if you should call that a captain, but like the captain who leads the MC-75 Star Cruiser. That's actually what this is talking about, not so much about the starship itself, right? So so Camus writes about a character called Dr. Rieu in The Plague, right? So The Plague is also like a fictional story that is actually a philosophical work, right? An essay. So and this is a person who is crushed by the weight of responsibility for others. The character embodies the conflict between individual suffering and collective responsibility that we have been talking about earlier in these notes. As he is leading a medical response to mass deaths occurring in the story, and the weight of this is never resolved, he's never triumphant, and he just keeps on going. Like, so again, the same storyline, right? It's very, very important. He seeks to make a point that's incredibly hopeful for people and incredibly impactful, I think. So the weight of this is never resolved, he's never triumphant, and he just keeps going. So the story never becomes like, oh, it's over and like everything is amazing, right? That never happens, right? So the story begins with the sudden appearance of dead rats, followed by an ever escalating death toll among the human population. Local authorities are hesitant to act, but as the situation worsens, the city is placed under a strict and claustrophobic quarantine. Citizens are cut off from the outside world, separated from their loved ones, and are being forced to confront the sudden, unfair, and completely random nature of death, right? So I do think like a lot of people have suffered life in the sense like life being sudden, unfair, and completely random in a sense, as though life would be indifferent to us, which is kind of like how Camus would see it, right? So, freedom, Camus argues, becomes terrifyingly personal in a world without divine authority. If there is no external force to declare us free from guilt, blame, responsibility, or the consequences of wrongdoing, then every choice carries its full moral weight. So it's kind of interesting. So even like we believe in divine authority, so at least I assume that you believe in that if you follow this channel, right? But like if you follow this journey, but like even if you would not believe in that, Camus would even then say, like, that actually makes your choices even more powerful. So if you are an atheist, this actually makes every choice you make have an even worse moral weight, right? So it's even you are have an even bigger moral responsibility then if there is no one to declare you free from guilt, blame, responsibility on the consequences of your wrongdoing, right? And every choice you make carries its full moral weight because you can't give any of it, you cannot give any of it to a divine authority, right? Just like a commander on a capital ship in Star Wars who is responsible for thousands of lives. The ship itself isn't responsible for this. The overwhelm that comes with such great responsibility goes to the person at the helm of the ship, not towards the ship he is steering. Ryu has no guarantee of success, no cosmic reassurance in the story that his efforts actually matter, and the people that fall under his responsibility are dying constantly. But he cannot leave the situation. Ryu doesn't know when the plague will stop. Perhaps in summer, perhaps in winter time, maybe next spring, or maybe never. Still, he does the same process day after day. He never gives up. He endures the pain of separation from loved ones and conceals his own personal feelings of the grief he feels for the dead. In the beginning of the story, the citizens still rely on wishful thinking instead of taking the necessary action. Later, as the plague worsens, hope vanishes from the town altogether, and Ryu doesn't go on to console himself with optimism. No, he looks directly at the odds, accepts that they are terrible, and works tirelessly anyway. I think it's very important, right? To be a little bit like Ryu in the story, right? To be like, okay, I don't console myself with optimism. There are certain situations where you don't want to console yourself with optimism, where you just want to look directly at the odds. If you know, like, the odds are not in your favor, and it may be like I have to accept that my odds are terrible, right? And you work tirelessly anyway, right? Camus would say that false hope is like a trap that makes collapse much more likely, because when hope fails, the person also then fails. Rieu tends to a boy in the story who is ill, despite knowing that he is losing the fight, purely for the sake of the boy's right to live. The fight itself may be lost, but living for the struggle to end suffering and to protect life itself is what we can do to create meaning in our lives, even if things feel meaningless to us. The sheer scale of it all, thousands of people being sick in the story, right? Pretty much the whole city, you could say, fighting, and he was fighting an invisible enemy. Rieu survives this by returning again and again to the single patient that is in front of him, right? It's a powerful metaphor, right? So you could say in Star Wars terms, you could say that this would be like the the captain of a ship. You could say that the ship is itself is too large to keep in the mind of the captain, right? Just like everything that is happening in the story is too much for the person at the helm of it all, right? For you, like if you would look at the entire thing that's happening, it would be too overwhelming. It would be too much. What does he do instead? He focuses on one patient at a time, over and over and over again. Although he knows he's losing the fight, although he knows that perhaps for his entire life he will have to like be show there up there for this patient and the next patient and the next patient, right? So he is in a hopeless war, you could say, but at the same time, like he keeps on being there, right? So, so Camus said that suffering is personal, but if you see it as an act of rebellion, one's suffering can become collective. The people who join the resistance may not hold the real power. They may be a waiter, a small business owner, whatever it may be, but they know that fighting the plague is not just a matter to be dealt with by doctors and nurses. They understand that the plague is everyone's business. The captain of the ship who tries to carry the full weight alone is for Camus making a philosophical error as much as a practical one. The overwhelm is not a sign of personal inadequacy. It is a natural response to an impossible situation And the answer is not solidarity, nor is it stoicism. Rio is exhausted throughout the story of the plague. He doesn't pretend otherwise. Camus doesn't ask Rio to rise above this, right? He writes the character. He doesn't ask of Rio to rise above the exhaustion. He is exhausted throughout the entire story, right? Which is also very powerful. He simply asks of his character to keep going within it, tired, grieving, facing uncertainty, but still showing up fully present to it all. I think you can hear that, right? He's still showing up fully present to it all. Let's acknowledge Ryu as being a hero, right? So Camus doesn't believe in inspiration or resolve or faith. He believes in something that is much quieter and much harder to do: to accept that the weight is real, to abandon false hope, and to return to the single person that is in front of you again and again, to share the burden with others, and to do the next thing you are required to do, not because it will work, because it is the only honest response available to a person who refuses to look away. That, for Camus, is what it means to be at the helm of a ship. And that's the end of my notes. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I'm wishing you a very beautiful day ahead. Bye bye.